The apartment complex on Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles was the kind of place where people kept to themselves. Tenants passed each other in the hallways with polite nods, exchanged brief greetings in the laundry room, and otherwise lived in quiet anonymity. It was the mid-1970s, and Rodney Alcala was just another face in the crowd, a man in his early 30s with dark, wavy hair, piercing eyes, and an unsettling charm. To his neighbors, he was an eccentric but harmless photographer, the kind of guy who might invite you over for wine and conversation. But behind that carefully constructed facade lurked a monster. Alcala was intelligent, well-spoken, and disarmingly charismatic. He had studied film at NYU under Roman Polanski and even appeared on The Dating Game in 1978, winning a date with a bachelorette who later refused to go out with him because he gave her creepy vibes. To the outside world, he was just another struggling artist. But in the shadows, he was refining his craft, not as a photographer, but as a hunter of human prey. Neighbors would later recall small, unsettling details that should have set off alarms. The way he always seemed to be watching, his gaze lingering a little too long. The faint metallic scent that sometimes wafted from his apartment when he opened the door. The occasional muffled scream or thud that echoed through the walls late at night, dismissed as a loud TV or a drunken argument. One woman, Ellen Hover, lived just a few doors down. She was an aspiring musician, beautiful and full of life. She vanished in 1977, and though her disappearance made the news, no one connected it to Alcala. Not even when another neighbor, a young woman named Jill Barkham, went missing shortly after. One evening, a neighbor, a college student whose name has since been lost to time, knocked on Alcala's door to borrow sugar. When he answered, she was struck by the smell. It wasn't just bad, it was wrong. A thick, coppery stench mixed with something rotten. Alcala smiled, blocking her view inside, but not before she caught a glimpse of dark stains on the carpet. "Accident with my camera chemicals," he said smoothly, handing her a cup of sugar. She left quickly, her skin crawling. She told her roommate later, "There's something off about that guy," but neither of them called the police. When Alcala was finally arrested in 1979 for the murder of 12-year-old Robin Samso, investigators began piecing together his horrifying double life. They found a storage locker filled with hundreds of photographs, some of women smiling, unaware of the danger they were in, others in states of distress, bound and terrified. There were driver's licenses, earrings, and locks of hair, trophies from victims whose fates remain unknown. Police believe Alcala may have killed as many as 130 people, though he was only ever convicted of 7 murders. His method was chillingly methodical. He would approach women, and sometimes children, in public places, posing as a photographer scouting models. He'd offer them money, fame, or simply a chance to be seen, and then he'd lead them to their deaths. After his arrest, the people who lived around him were left with a sickening realization. They could have stopped him. The screams they dismissed, the strange smells they ignored, the way he always seemed to befriend young women who later disappeared. One neighbor, an elderly man who lived directly below Alcala, admitted to hearing thumping sounds like someone dragging furniture late at night. He never called the police. Another recalled seeing Alcala washing what looked like blood off his hands in the building's shared bathroom. He assumed it was paint. Rodney Alcala died on death row in 2021, never revealing the full extent of his crimes. To this day, unidentified women in his photographs remain nameless, their families left without answers. And the most terrifying part? He wasn't hiding. He was right there, smiling in the hallway, chatting in the elevator, blending in perfectly. Because the scariest monsters don't live in the shadows. They live next door. I should have known. That's what keeps me up at night now, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of suburban life outside my window, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional car rolling down Muir Woods Road. Normal sounds, safe sounds. but I can't hear them anymore without remembering the other sounds, the ones I ignored for years. It started small, the way these things always do. The Turpins moved into the beige ranch-style house next door in 2011, a quiet couple with an army of children. 13 of them, though I didn't know the exact number at first. No one did. They arrived in a caravan of vans, the kids filing out in perfect single file, all wearing identical polo shirts and jeans, their hair neatly combed. At the time, I remember thinking they looked like a church group or one of those homeschooling families who take modesty seriously. Louise Turpin was the first to introduce herself. She came over with a plate of cookies that first week, her smile wide but never quite reaching her eyes. "We're so excited to be part of the neighborhood," she said, her voice sugary sweet. "Our children are homeschooled, so you won't see much of them during the day." I didn't think anything of it then. Plenty of families homeschooled. But now I realize how carefully constructed that lie was. The first real warning came about 6 months after they moved in. It was July, the kind of scorching Southern California afternoon where the air shimmers over the asphalt. I was out back tending to my roses when I heard it, a high-pitched wail that cut through the heat like a knife. Not a child's tantrum. This was raw, guttural, the kind of sound you'd expect from someone being... I didn't let myself finish the thought. It came from the Turpins' house. I stood there, garden shears in hand, frozen. The scream stopped as abruptly as it started. A minute later, Louise Turpin stepped out onto their back porch, humming to herself as she shook out a rug. She saw me watching and waved cheerfully. "Hot enough for you?" she called. I should have called the police that day. Instead, I convinced myself I'd imagined the scream, or that it was just one of the kids having a nightmare. That's what we do, isn't it? We find reasonable explanations for unreasonable things. The signs kept coming. That fall, I noticed the Turpin kids only came outside at night. I'd catch glimpses of them through their bedroom window sometimes, their faces pale in the moonlight, moving like ghosts behind the glass. They never played in the yard, never rode bikes, never laughed. One evening around Halloween, I saw 2 of the younger girls. They couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, standing perfectly still in their upstairs window. They were so thin their collarbones protruded sharply under their nightgowns. As I watched, one of them slowly raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Then Louise Turpin appeared behind them and yanked them away so violently I actually gasped. I told my husband about it that night. "They're just strict," he said, shrugging. "Some people raise their kids that way." So I did nothing. The smells started the following summer. At first, it was just a faint whiff of something unpleasant when the wind blew from their direction. Then it grew stronger, a thick, cloying stench of rot and human waste that made my eyes water when I took out the trash. I mentioned it to another neighbor, an older woman named Marjorie who lived across the street. "That house always smells like death," she said bluntly. "I saw one of those kids eating out of the dog's bowl last week, just crouched there in the backyard, shoveling kibble into her mouth with her hands." We looked at each other for a long moment. Then Marjorie shook her head. "Not our business," she muttered, and walked away. The years passed. The Turpin children grew older without ever seeming to grow up. I'd see them sometimes when David Turpin herded them into the family van for what I assumed were rare outings. They moved like robots, their arms stiff at their sides, their eyes empty. The older ones looked like children despite being clearly in their 20s, their growth stunted, their faces oddly unlined. Then came the night everything changed. January 14th, 2018, a Sunday. I was making tea when I heard the crash. At first I thought someone had hit a trash can. Then I heard the screaming. I ran to the window just in time to see a skeletal figure tumbling from a second-story window of the Turpin house. She hit the porch roof below with a sickening thud, rolled off, and landed in the bushes. For one terrible moment, she didn't move. Then, with what looked like every ounce of strength left in her broken body, she dragged herself upright. Even from across the yard, I could see the sores on her arms, the way her pajamas hung off her like she was a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. Her hair was matted, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds. This was Jordan Turpin, 17 years old. She staggered to my door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When I opened it, she thrust a battered cell phone at me, one I later learned she'd never been allowed to use. "Call 911, she whispered. "Please." As I made the call, Jordan collapsed on my doorstep, her body racked with sobs. Between gasps, she told me things no child should ever have to say. About being chained to her bed for months at a time. About being beaten if she tried to wash herself. About watching her siblings waste away to skin and bone while their parents gorged themselves on fast food in front of them. When the police arrived, they found a house of horrors. Children, no, young adults, chained to furniture, their muscles atrophied from years of confinement. A 29-year-old woman who looked like a preteen, her wrists scarred from years of shackles. Rooms filled with human waste where the Turpins had forced their children to live in their own filth. The worst part? The neighbors knew. Not everything, but enough. We'd heard the screams, seen the emaciated faces, smelled the rot, and we'd done nothing. Now, when I walk past that empty house, I don't see a quiet suburban home. I see a prison, a torture chamber, a place where 13 innocent souls lived in hell while the rest of us turned away. The Turpins are in prison now, where they belong. Their children are finally free, but none of us who lived nearby will ever truly be free of what we allowed to happen right next door. Because the truth is, monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they live in the house next door, and sometimes we let them. I still smell it sometimes when the wind blows from the west. That faint, coppery tang mixed with something far worse, something that clings to the back of your throat like rotting meat. They told us afterwards it was the drains, that the whole street had bad plumbing. We believed them. God help us, we wanted to believe them. I moved into 24 Cromwell Street in the summer of 1972, fresh from nursing school and full of that naive optimism young women have before life teaches them better. Fred and Rose West were already there at number 25, their house slightly shabbier than the others on the street, the garden overgrown, the paint peeling. They introduced themselves that first week with a bottle of homemade wine and stories about their growing family. At first, they seemed like any other working-class couple in Gloucester. Fred with his rough builder's hands and constant cigarettes, Rose with her loud laugh and too short skirts, the kind of neighbors who'd lend you sugar or watch your cat when you were away, the kind you'd never suspect. The screams started that autumn. It was always late at night, usually Fridays after the pubs closed. High-pitched animal sounds that would cut through the thin walls of our terraced houses. I'd lie awake, clutching my blanket, telling myself it was just marital spats. Everyone on the street heard them, old Mrs. Peacock at number 23, the Wilkinson boys at 27, but we all found reasons not to intervene. Some couples are like that, Mrs. Peacock would say over tea, her wrinkled hands trembling around her cup. Best not to get involved. Then the digging began. Fred was always out in that garden, no matter the weather. I'd watch from my kitchen window as he tore at the earth with strange urgency, sometimes late into the night under the glow of a single bulb. The neighbors joked about his landscaping obsession, about how nothing ever seemed to grow there no matter how much he toiled. I remember one particularly cold night in '74 when I woke to the sound of shoveling at 3 a.m. Through my bedroom window, I saw Fred waist-deep in a hole, his breath coming in white puffs as he worked. Rose stood over him, holding something large and wrapped in plastic. When she caught me watching, she smiled, that wide, empty smile, and waved. The next morning, there was a new patio where the hole had been. The smells got worse as the years passed. That sweet, sick stench of decay that seemed to emanate from their basement. We complained to the council multiple times about the drains, and they'd send someone round to poke at the pipes, but it never helped. The Wilkinsons' dog would go mad whenever it got near their garden, barking and snarling at patches of bare earth. Then there were the girls. So many girls passed through that house. Hitchhikers Fred picked up, teenage runaways Rose would employ as babysitters. They'd disappear into number 25 and never come out again. We told ourselves they'd moved on, found better jobs, gone back to their families. The parties were the worst. Loud, raucous affairs that would spill into the street, Fred drunk and leering, Rose laughing as she dragged some dazed-looking girl into a back room. The morning after, there'd always be fresh patches of disturbed earth in the garden. I remember Heather, their eldest, a quiet girl who used to sneak over to borrow books from me when her parents weren't looking. One day in '87, she simply wasn't there anymore. Gone to stay with relatives, Rose said brightly when I asked. But Heather's things were still in her room, her school books gathering dust. When the police finally came in '94, it wasn't for Heather. It was for the others, the ones we'd pretended not to see coming and going. They tore up that house for weeks, pulling up floorboards, digging through the garden. The things they found: bones under the bathroom tiles, a child's femur used as a doorstop in the basement, the remains of 8 women buried in the garden, their skulls fractured, their bodies twisted into unnatural positions. Heather's remains were found beneath the patio, the one Fred had poured that night in '74. The worst part? We'd known. Not everything, but enough. We'd heard the screams, seen the girls disappear, smelled the rotting flesh. We'd watched Fred dig those graves in plain sight and told ourselves it was just gardening. Rose still claims she's innocent, you know. Sits in her cell writing letters to anyone who'll listen, still playing the victim after all these years. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear the screams. And I know, we all know, that we could have stopped it if we'd just been brave enough to ask the right questions. But we didn't. And that's the real horror of Cromwell Street. Not just what they did, but how easily we all looked away.